you wake up on a dirt floor. The ceiling above you is made of dried grass, barely an arm's length away. The walls around you, bamboo, pressed mud, silence. Outside, you hear the creak of wooden carts, the distant ring of iron being worked, the sound of an empire that has declared itself the greatest civilization on Earth. This is that empire. Forget what you learned in school. Forget the gold coins, the Sanskrit manuscripts, the astronomers mapping the stars. The Gupta Empire, the civilization historians would one day call the Golden Age of India, built temples that still stand after 16 centuries. But the people who worshipped in those temples went home to structures that left no trace, not because they were primitive, because no one thought their homes were worth preserving. Over 90% of the population lived in single-room shelters made of materials that rot, burn, and disappear. The sacred was built in stone. The human was built to be forgotten. And while the court of Pataliputra commissioned poetry and calculated the movement of planets a few miles away, families slept in the same room where they cooked, worked, and buried their dead. There is a version of this golden age that history chose to remember. This is not that version. What does it cost to live inside a civilization that sees your home as temporary and your life as the same? And what happened to the millions whose houses the golden age never bothered to protect? The world you are entering existed somewhere between 320 and 550 of the Common Era, on the vast alluvial plains stretching from the mouth of the Indus to the delta of the Ganges, across a territory that, at its peak, encompassed most of what is today northern India, Pakistan, and Bangladesh. The Gupta rulers, beginning with Chandragupta I and reaching their greatest extent under Chandragupta II, presided over a state of extraordinary administrative complexity. This was not a loose confederation of chieftains. It was a structured empire with provincial governors, standardized gold coinage, a functioning legal system, and a tax apparatus that reached into every village and every harvest. The empire's population is estimated to have numbered in the tens of millions, spread across hundreds of settlements, most of them rural, most of them invisible to the records that survived. Pataliputra, the imperial capital on the southern bank of the Ganges, was one of the largest cities on Earth at the time, a place of palaces, guilds, royal courts, and carefully maintained streets. But Pataliputra was not India. It was the face that India chose to show. Behind it lay a country of mud walls and thatched roofs, of oxen pulling wooden plows through flooded fields, of women carrying clay water vessels on their heads before the sun had fully risen. The empire stretched for over 3 million square kilometers. The average person living within it would never travel more than 30 kilometers from where they were born. That gap between the scale of the empire and the radius of a single life is where this story lives. The Gupta state collected land revenue as its primary source of income, typically demanding between 1/6 and 1/4 of a farmer's annual yield. Customs duties were levied on trade goods at rates that could reach 1/5 of total value. Laborers were required to perform unpaid public work, building roads, digging irrigation canals, maintaining the infrastructure of power for a fixed number of days each year. The empire's prosperity was real, but it was not equally distributed. It never was. If you find this account worth your time, leave a like before we go further. Subscribe if you want to keep walking through worlds that history forgot to mention. Now, if you can, lower the lights, set everything else aside. What follows deserves your full attention. The Gupta state presented itself through the figure of the king as a cosmic sovereign, the Chakravartin, the wheel-turner, the one whose authority extended in every direction without opposition. This was not mere metaphor. It was political theology made into administrative practice. The emperor held ultimate control over land, labor, and law. Provincial governors, known as uparikas, ruled on his behalf, answerable directly to the imperial court and removable at will. Below them, district officers called Vishayapatis managed taxation, adjudicated local disputes, and ensured that the revenue extracted from villages reached the treasury without interruption. The system was layered, efficient, and designed with one primary objective: the continued flow of resources upward. The caste hierarchy that structured Gupta society was not simply a spiritual or philosophical arrangement. It was an administrative tool. Brahmins occupied the highest rung, priests, scholars, and legal interpreters whose pronouncements on dharma, on duty and righteous conduct carried the force of state authority. What they declared sacred, the state enforced. What they declared profane, the state punished. Below them, the kshatriyas, warriors and rulers, wielded the sword that backed the priest's word. The vaishyas, merchants, traders, guild leaders, circulated the wealth that both sword and word depended upon. And beneath them, composing the vast majority of the empire's population, the shudras, farmers, laborers, artisans, servants. They could not own land in most regions. They could not access the same temples, the same courts, the same protections under law. They performed the physical labor on which the entire civilization rested and received in return the permanent guarantee of their own subordination. This was not a system in crisis, it was a system functioning exactly as designed. The law books of the Gupta period codified obligations in precise detail. Who owed what to whom, which transgressions merited which punishments, how debt could be transferred across generations. A man who could not pay his taxes might surrender his labor. If his labor was insufficient, his children's labor could be pledged as settlement. The empire was patient. It could afford to be. It had already built its permanence in stone. Step into a Gupta village on an ordinary morning, and the first thing that reaches you is not sight, but smell. The smoke of dung fuel fires, the rancid edge of standing water in the lanes, the animal warmth of oxen and goats confined in pens pressed against the outer walls of houses. The streets are narrow, barely wide enough for 2 carts to pass, and they are never quiet. Vendors arrange piles of grain and dried legumes on low platforms of packed earth. A blacksmith's hammer rings from an open stall. Somewhere nearby, a weaver's loom produces a low rhythmic knock that does not stop. The houses lining these streets are built low, with walls of bamboo and packed mud, their roofs laid with dried grass or palm fronds. A typical house has 1 room. 1. Inside that room, a family of 5 or 6 sleeps, eats, argues, grieves, and recovers from illness. There is no separation between the space for rest and the space for cooking. The hearth is in the corner. The sleeping mats are rolled against the wall when not in use. Possessions are minimal and stored in clay pots or suspended from the ceiling in woven baskets. The floor is the same earth that exists outside. The air inside moves only when the single door or the single window is opened, and it carries with it the same smoke and animal smell as the street. Even the homes of local nobles in most villages were built of wood. Even the palaces of provincial governors were timber structures, larger and more decorated, but no less perishable than the houses of the farmers below them. Stone was reserved for the gods. Wood and bamboo were for the living. The urban centers of the Gupta world told a different story, but only for those positioned to read it. In Pataliputra, in Ujjain, in Ayodhya and Kannauj, the streets widened into actual roads. Drainage channels ran between buildings. Public gardens existed, and in certain quarters of the city, the outer walls of elite houses were whitened with lime and inlaid with decorative fragments of coral or colored stone. Behind those walls, the house divided into outer and inner apartments, the outer for receiving visitors, the inner for domestic life. Gardens were planted with flowering trees. Carved wooden furniture stood in rooms where oil lamps burned through the night. But this world, the world of the Nagara, the cultivated urban resident, existed for a fraction of the population, surrounded on all sides by the other city. The porters carrying loads through the pre-dawn darkness, the water carriers moving between wells and doorways, the tanners and sweepers working in the quarters furthest from the temple precincts, their presence allowed by day and their proximity resented regardless. The city was not a shared space. It was a hierarchy made physical, given streets and walls and the smell of rotting refuse in lanes where no drainage had been installed, because the people who lived there were not the kind of people the city had been built to protect. Most people in the Gupta Empire were farmers, and farming in this period meant subsistence, growing enough to eat with whatever remained after taxation set aside for the following planting season. Wheat dominated on the northern plains. Rice was cultivated in the wetter eastern regions. Lentils, beans, various vegetables, and a range of fruits supplemented the grain base. In the earlier centuries of the empire, meals included meat. As Buddhism spread through certain regions and Brahmanical restrictions tightened in others, vegetarianism became more common, particularly among those whose caste position made religious compliance both a spiritual obligation and a social survival strategy. But vegetarianism did not mean abundance. For a Shudra farmer, a meal was rice or flatbread with a portion of lentils, perhaps a handful of vegetables cooked in a clay pot over a dung fire. Variation was seasonal and unpredictable. Drought or flood meant not variation, but absence. The labor that produced this food was unrelenting. Men plowed and sowed and harvested. Women processed grain, grinding it by hand, a task that consumed hours each day and left specific marks of wear on the skeletal remains of women from this period, visible in the bones of the wrist and shoulder. Children carried water, gathered fuel, tended animals. There was no age at which a person's labor was not required. The empire demanded its own share of that labor directly, requiring a fixed period of public works each year, unpaid, non-negotiable, enforced by the same administrative apparatus that collected the harvest tax. Women occupied a contradictory position in Gupta society. The literature of the period, the poetry, the plays, the philosophical texts, often described women with reverence, particularly in domestic and devotional roles. But the lived reality was far more constrained. Marriage was arranged early, often before adolescence. A woman's status derived entirely from her relationship to a male household. First her father, then her husband. Widowhood carried severe social consequences. Remarriage, while legally permitted in certain texts, was socially discouraged to the point of near impossibility for most. Disease moved through villages with an efficiency no administrative system could match. The proximity of animals to living spaces, the use of standing water, the absence of any understanding of germ transmission, these ensured that infection was a permanent feature of Gupta life. Dysentery, malaria, smallpox, cholera, these were not exceptional events, they were seasons. Children were especially vulnerable. A significant proportion of those born did not survive past the age of 5. This was not exceptional by ancient standards. It was simply the condition of being alive in a world where the state's investment in preservation was architectural, theological, and reserved exclusively for the sacred. What this civilization built for eternity was built out of stone, and it was built for gods. What it built for human beings was built out of wood and grass and clay, materials chosen not out of poverty of imagination, but out of a coherent worldview that understood human life as temporary, impermanent, a passage through a world that would outlast all individual experience. There is something honest in that vision, and something brutal in its consequences. The person sleeping on a packed earth floor in a bamboo room somewhere on the Gangetic Plain in the 4th century of the Common Era would not have described their situation as tragedy. They would not have framed their life in the vocabulary of lack or deprivation. They understood their world as a world, complete in itself, governed by forces larger than individual will, organized by duties and obligations that had been in place before their birth and would remain in place after their death. That understanding was not resignation. It was the operating logic of a civilization. But it also meant that the question of who built the stone temples and who never entered them was not a question the civilization was structured to ask. The gap between the carved gods still standing in museum collections and the vanished houses of the people who carved them is not accidental. It is the physical record of a system of value, one that decided, with great consistency and over many centuries, what was worth preserving and what was not. The houses are gone. The people inside them are gone. What remains is the stone, the gold coins, the mathematical treatises, the Sanskrit poetry, all of it produced by a society that also contained millions of lives it never thought worth recording. Those lives were the foundation on which every surviving achievement rested. Walking away from this, the question that does not resolve is not historical, it is immediate. Every civilization decides what it builds to last and what it permits to disappear. The choice of what to make permanent is always also a choice about who matters. The Gupta Empire made that choice in stone. What it left behind tells us everything about the Golden Age, and almost nothing about the people who lived inside it.